Time magazine recently published a piece about how various activist groups and power structures conspired in order to, quote, fortify the 2020 election. In the article, most shockingly, they admit to controlling the flow of information and the covert silencing of various news stories during the cycle. What isn't shocking is that this happened. What is shocking is that they openly admitted it in Time magazine after spending years denying it. This direct intervention of political content through the media and specifically social media by censorship and algorithm changes was designed not to educate or improve the conversation as Time and the powers that be claim to, but it was to take down certain ideologies and dampen the spread of information counter to the liberal narrative. On the major platforms such as Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Facebook, and the other tech giants, conservative voices and points of view have been slowly but surely since the 2016 election severely dampened or completely silenced in favor of left-leaning and mainstream media sources. The history of the censorship is documented extensively by those who have been victim to such and by the viewers who have seen their favorite content creators driven underground or forced to quit due to monetization and deplatforming. Those who deny this cycle, as many have for the past 4 to 5 years, are becoming unable to deny the obvious reality at hand, as figures as major as the US president have been terminated by the major platforms. The reasoning for these bannings is irrelevant, as we can produce countless whataboutism of those on the left getting away with breaking the terms of service with only slaps on the wrist, while right-wingers will always get the book thrown at them.
Oh.
You genuinely do hate conservatives, don't you?
Very much so. I've moved full on to like the political violence level or the real violence level when it comes to conservative people. Yeah, I think they need to be like excised from my fucking country. I think they are demonstrably fucking evil people by any moral system that most people would use. And then I just hate them because they tend to destroy the outcomes related to this country, which is what I'm concerned with. Yeah, absolutely.
They also cannot deny the history of changing and expansion of the terms of service in order to make it harder for right-wingers to hold different moral values and beliefs than those on the left who run the tech giants. The endless expansion of hate speech definitions to meet the demands of journalists and activist groups to end online hate and radicalization has left nothing but a trail of lost history and lost potential, as those who weren't able to recover from initial bannings had no reconciliation. It is arguable that the entire visible internet has been rewired over the past 4 years in order to damage certain points of view, but also have hurt everyone else in the process. We will be tracking year by year the behaviors and draw a timeline of events from 2016 to 2020 on the platforms YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit to demonstrate a pattern of increased censorship and restrictions on the free flow of information. That being changes in the algorithms and notable bannings that have occurred over the years. Something we will not be discussing is the various tech hearings held by the Republican Senate during the Trump administration, since they accomplished nothing and I don't want to give them the time of day since they don't deserve it. Starting before 2016, however, let's go over the basic beginnings of expansion of the terms of service. On YouTube, many of us are old enough to remember watching full movies in 10 separate parts on our Windows XP desktops. Although creating great memories, this created great problems for Google and YouTube. Copyright infringements were the platform's first real test to see how it could regulate a website with millions of hours of content being uploaded every day. The first attempts were semi-successful in the late 2000s to cut down on pirated content. In 2008, they began a 3-strike policy for copyrighted content, which would eventually be expanded into the 3 strikes for all infractions rule. Although protecting one's property in the form of video content is a good thing, the ball was now rolling on an ever-expansive and reactionary TOS expansion to meet the needs of the day. The first notable political censorship on YouTube was in 2007 when YouTube suspended Egyptian user Wael Abbas. Abbas, an award-winning blogger and anti-torture activist who had used the platform to draw attention to police brutality in Egypt. YouTube was accused of being beholden to the will of the Egyptian government, which they denied. In October of that year, controversial British comic Pat Condell uploaded a clip entitled "Welcome to Saudi Britain," in which he ridiculed British Muslims while simultaneously denouncing the corrupt Saudi regime. The company removed the video and issued a warning to Condell, noting YouTube's community guidelines and stating that users who break the rules risk having their account disabled. Notably, the company did not state which rule Condell had violated, foreshadowing the restriction of anti-immigration content. Twitter also had a political incident similar in 2009, with the Iranian protests foreshadowing even more so its power to drive discourse that President Obama had pioneered in his 2008 campaign. The next major incident was the Benghazi attack, when the Obama administration blamed the YouTube video "The Innocence of Muslims" on the attack, prompted vast criticism to YouTube, even after they restricted access to the video in Egypt and Libya. With the rise of ISIS, YouTube were forced to clamp down even harder on terrorist content and violent rhetoric, as were the other major social media platforms. But by 2016, the platforms were coming to question their own power and influence, not knowing what to do with it or how to properly handle it. Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit had similar evolutions over the late 2000s to mid-2010s. Expansions of rules/terms of service in order to meet the demands and respond to the crises of the day, leading to the machine to be fully unleashed over the next 4 years against the online right. We begin our timeline with the year of the election of President Trump. By this time, algorithm changes have begun to take place, but the power of these didn't raise enough alarm bells. By this point, Google, the owner of YouTube, had notably banned in December of 2015 singer Joyce Bartholomew for creating a pro-life music video. She also went on to sue the website. Google, with its power base, uses a multiple-pronged approach to censorship and blacklisting. We will talk about the relevant ones. The first was the autocomplete blacklist. This is a list of words and phrases that are excluded from the autocomplete feature in Google's search bar. Studies have found, even back then, that if Google autocomplete suppressed negative search suggestions for one candidate for several months, they estimate that between 800,000 and 3.2 million undecided voters might shift towards that candidate. Manipulating autocomplete is particularly powerful because negative search suggestions draw more clicks than neutral or positive ones. But Google can do more than adjust autocomplete. Search results can also favor one candidate over the other. Boosting web pages that make one candidate look better is common practice. Based on published research, they estimate that search ranking manipulation could drive 2.6 to 10.4 million votes towards the favored candidate. The second relevant prong is the YouTube blacklist, in which users are allowed to flag content for review, but an extreme lack of consistent enforcement is hard not to notice. While at this time, prank YouTubers are allowed to grope strangers with no pushback, political content, like the previously discussed case, were routinely banned. The third prong is its news aggregator blacklist. Even back in 2006, Google was accused of excluding conservative news sources that generated stories critical of Islam, and the company has also been accused of banning individual columnists and competing companies from its newsfeed. Today, Breitbart and other sources are completely excluded. YouTube earlier this year entered an agreement with the European Union, Twitter, Facebook, and others in order to combat hate speech in compliance with EU laws. This sparked the hashtag I stand with hate speech, claiming that censorship is worse than so-called hate speech. YouTube also began in 2016 making use of its demonetization practices we are all familiar with today. The hashtag YouTube is over party controversy began when major creators such as Philip DeFranco and other vloggers noticed a lot of their videos flagged as not advertiser friendly, a mark that would be used in the future to strip conservative creators of their income. Many channels also saw a decline in viewership that even affected PewDiePie, who made a video documenting his decline in viewership after the November 10th algorithm update. It's important to note that this isn't really a First Amendment issue. Jeff Hermes, deputy director of the Media Law Resource Center, said in an interview, YouTube is a private entity and has the right to run advertising or not on its content as it will. I'm sure he was well aware of the fact that YouTube had become many creators' sole income and that stripping them of that is effectively stripping them of their ability to continue, but seemed not to care at all. YouTube also introduced an advanced automatic moderation for mass use. Twitter's behavior during the 2016 election year was very busy. During the election season, the most notable banning was of course Milo Yiannopoulos, but now mostly forgotten is when the WikiLeaks of Clinton's emails dropped, Twitter took the personal liberty of silencing over 50% of all tweets using the hashtag DNCLeaks under the guise of stopping foreign intervention. Twitter's policies on hate speech were already defined and expansion wouldn't begin until 2018, however. Most bannings were due to individuals targeted for such or by mass reporting. After the 2016 election, Twitter banned various alt-right/dissident right personalities off Twitter, such as the initial bannings of Paul Town, Pax Dickinson, Ricky Vaughn, John Rivers, Richard Spencer and his publications and think tank NPI. Some of these accounts would be reinstated, however. This ban wave directly after the election was notable because it was the first case of a banning directly caused by intervention from an outside group, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Heidi Barrick, who was a spokeswoman for the SPLC, told USA Today that the center had asked Twitter to remove more than 100 accounts of white supremacists who violated Twitter's terms of service. She also pointed to 2 alt-right accounts who had been verified by Twitter, Richard Spencer's and Mike Heimbach's. Twitter made good on its announcements to begin cracking down on hate speech, encouraged by the research of the ADL and SPLC to justify it. Also of note, the ADL declared Pepe a hate symbol at this time. The free speech platform Gab.ai was founded to compete with Twitter this year as well. Onto the behaviors of Reddit during 2016. We begin with the notable use of the website's quarantine function with the subreddit European, supposedly due to a lack of moderation. The major episode and stain on Reddit's history to this day was its response to the Pulse nightclub shooting, where a self-described member of ISIS killed nearly 50 people at a gay bar in Florida. When it came out that a Muslim was the perpetrator of this, the r/news mods went to work with prohibiting discussion of the breaking news story. What made this so infamous was that Reddit users were then forced to go to the now infamous community to get accurate, up-to-date information on the terror attack. That community being /r/TheDonald. The Donald would go on to become the largest pro-Trump conservative subreddit on the website as a result of its reputation from this incident. The r/newsmods would later apologize for their behavior. Later that year, Reddit's CEO, known commonly as Spez, was caught editing comments on The Donald and then apologized for the unethical behavior. He also, after the election, changed Reddit's front page algorithm in order to prevent The Donald from reaching the front page as easily as it could before. Reddit in the coming years would become arguably the most aggressive in banning right-leaning communities and commentators, exemplified by the creation of r/against hate subreddits, commonly known as AHS. AHS would regularly get away with breaking Reddit's rule of no brigading in order to get communities banned and practically served as a secret police for the Reddit admins. After the 2016 election, Google held a meeting with its leadership and employees, which was recorded and sent to Breitbart News. In this meeting, the leadership and staff agreed that the election of Trump and his ascendant movement was a tragedy and must be stopped by any means necessary. They knew what power they held to change outcomes and control the conversation, and they were going to use it. YouTube terms of service changes to combat hate would begin the next year. YouTube in 2017 would become much more aggressive and targeting in its censorship practices. In a June blog post, they announced an increased effort to fight online terrorism and hate. We will be taking a tougher stance on videos that do not clearly violate our policies. For example, videos that contain inflammatory religious or supremacist content, says the blog post. The result was them limiting recommendations and features like comments and the ability to share the video. This step dramatically reduced views to these videos, on average of 80% according to YouTube themselves. This was in June, mind you, before the at the time biggest harbinger of censorship would occur, Charlottesville. The events of that day has been discussed to death, so I don't want to talk about them here. But the aftermath of increased censorship is an undeniable consequence. The immediate crackdown saw the deplatforming of the neo-Nazi website The Daily Stormer from Google and from its hosting infrastructure GoDaddy, after the Daily Stormer posted an article insulting the woman who died at the event. Twitter also banned Stormer-affiliated accounts such as Andrew Anglin and other, quote, far-right affiliated accounts. Google also removed Gab.ai from the Android Play Store. PayPal had also blocked hate groups from using its financial services, and the ride-hailing services Uber and Lyft had urged drivers to report unacceptable customers. Airbnb took steps to stop white nationalists from renting rooms through its app. Notorious Wignat Chris Cantwell was even banned from OkCupid after the events of CVO. Facebook took out pages such as Right Wing Death Squad and White Nationalists United, among others. Reddit banned r/physical removal, a group about ejecting communists from the country, and the subreddit Uncensored News. Discord also cracked down hard on alt-right adjacent chat rooms. Twitter then announced a renewed crackdown on hate. Companies and CEOs have an obligation, maybe even a moral obligation, to stand up for values, PayPal's chief executive Dan Schulman said in an interview with the New York Times. It's important here to describe in simple terms the structure of the internet. Decisions for censorship and acts don't just come from the websites themselves. As we have seen, they can come from service providers, hosting platforms, credit card companies, banks even, DDoS protection services, and all the various structures needed to operate a website in the modern age can and have participated in the ongoing path to total deplatforming. YouTube then started using its limited state mode much more liberally, in which the video would not be recommended and no one could comment. Such affected videos were from American Renaissance. Mark Dice also reported that YouTube punished him for a video about a church shooting outside Nashville the previous month, in which the assailant sought revenge for the attacks by white supremacist Dylan Roof, who attacked a black church in Charleston, South Carolina. His video about the incident, and him discussing the anti-white hate crime by naming it as such, was met with punishment from YouTube. A number of lesser-known conservatives were seeing similar restrictions placed on their videos by the website. One activist, Luke Radowski, said he had hundreds of his videos suddenly unable to run ads. The Las Vegas shooting was the next major event to result in an algorithm update. After the shooting, various conspiracies about the strange attack were shared in video format over YouTube, resulting in a crackdown and led to the creation of the title Reputable Sources, or authoritative sources as it would be known in 2018. This new classification for mainstream media channels and some left channels such as CNN, MSNBC, Jimmy Kimmel, and even the Young Turks allowed them special protections from the monetization systems and would promote these channels' content above original content from independent creators about politics and news topics. Notoriously, Jimmy Kimmel uploaded his segment on the Vegas shooting and was monetized, while YouTuber Casey Neistat's video, which is also a fundraiser for the victims, was demonetized. This solidified and made public what could be called a caste system, allowing certain certain groups and figures to make videos about topics, while the plebeian independent creators would be punished. This was part of what happened during the second quote, adpocalypse, which not only affected right-wing content, but all content on the website. Tim Pool is a notable example of a left-winger getting mass demonetized, but at this point his association and defense of the right's right to free speech makes him a special target. There's an argument to be made that these changes were not made with censorship in mind, but were made in order to appease the advertiser agencies. The one problem with that argument is that Google, the parent company, has a near total monopoly on internet advertising to begin with, and any coalition that attempts to protest Google for not being censorious enough would be fruitless. Although a factor, of course, Google and YouTube were more than happy to oblige demands to achieve what they already wanted to do. A researcher known as Selau uploaded a metadata analysis on over 800,000 demonetized videos to find out what about them caused their demonetization, and to confirm that videos demonetized received a huge dent in viewership compared to other videos. YouTube responded to this by getting rid of one of the variables that the researchers used to calculate their findings, causing more suspicion and even confirming that yes, YouTube was suppressing demonetized videos from its users, even after those videos may have been remonetized. These demonetization practices created a backlash even from the gay community, as some of their content was deemed inappropriate, such as various coming out videos. Future updates, however, would make sure that it was only the correct people being silenced. Twitter added many updates, but largely continued to enforce existing rules harder in 2017 rather than in 2018, where they would continue expansion. Notable bannings include the banning of Roger Stone, Jared Taylor and American Renaissance, Michael Hill, and the League of the South, Traditional Workers' Party, Baked Alaska, and James Alsop. A high-profile case of censorship was when Twitter blocked an ad by Marsha Blackburn, a Tennessee Republican who at the time was running for her Senate seat that she now occupies. 2018 would bring in the biggest escalation yet in censorship, backed up by outside advocacy groups and various new scientific studies about the effects of radicalization. 2018, the year of midterms, would see further escalations and a beta run for the 2020 Get Out to Vote advocacy of the tech giants. Although in good faith to want more people to vote, the platforms that did so continued to prioritize one point of view over the others. Groups like the ADL and SPLC were working with the tech firms to formulate strategies to further censor hate speech. The first major changes were noticed on Twitter. In January, James O'Keefe and Project Veritas released footage of Twitter software engineers who admitted to using a tactic called shadow banning for content they disagreed with. The terminology they used was they would shadow ban content they deemed would distract from the conversation. The newspeak in that statement is laughable and the effects obvious. They claimed the goal wasn't to ban mindsets, but a certain way of talking. In the video, Pranay Singh, a Twitter direct messaging engineer, admitted that most of the algorithms were set to be used against Republicans and conservatives, because they believed most of them to be from Russia. We see here the first Trump impeachment and the conspiracy theories that arose from it being used to justify further censorship. As a pattern, we have seen these changes to the website negatively affect not just the targets of censorship, but all users on the platform will also get caught in the crossfire, as a cascading effect was seen when many non-political accounts were shadow banned as well. The last big change for Twitter in 2018 was the introductions of rules against dehumanizing speech, which is put forth by the group The Dangerous Speech Project. The wording used in the new rules expansion was content that dehumanizes others based on their membership in an identifiable group, even when the material does not include a target. Other notable suspensions were of Laura Loomer, Paul Nehlen, the failed congressional candidate, Tommy Robinson, the British conservative activist, was banned after members of the British Labour Party leaned in on the platforms to censor him. Mike Enoch, the failed neo-Nazi, Owen Benjamin, the comedian, was banned for making fun of David Hogg. Megan Murphy, the Canadian journalist, was banned for misgendering a transgender person, marking a correction to past incidents of friendly fire. YouTube was also following suit. The narrative being crafted by advocacy groups was that YouTube's recommendation system was resulting in the vast radicalization of users, specifically to the far right. The Wall Street Journal published a hate speech claiming so, as did the New York Times. When the Parkland school shooting happened, the New York Times explains, many users were recommended videos claiming that the survivors were crisis actors, and that over 9,000 videos were promoting this idea. The piece also claimed that pro-Trump videos were more likely to be recommended than pro-Clinton videos, a claim that anyone who was around back then can confirm was simply a result of a lack of original pro-Clinton content on the platform. The New York Times and other groups accused YouTube of profiting off of radicalization through ad revenue. There is no reason to let a company make so much money while potentially helping to radicalize billions of people, reaping the financial benefits while asking society to bear so much of the cost, said the New York Times piece. Earlier that year, YouTube also hired a new moderation team and started making further use of the flagging systems, which resulted in the removal of various pro-Second Amendment channels. The major incident of the year was the coordinated banning of Alex Jones. YouTube kicked it off in the summer when they removed InfoWars from the site, which was followed by Facebook, removing Jones and his InfoWars accounts, alongside PayPal, within days of each other. YouTubers Lawrence Southern and Sargon of Akkad were also kicked off of Patreon this year. A week later, Twitter succumbed to pressure and banned Jones as well. H3H3 even got a channel strike for even talking about Jones on a live stream, but this was removed quickly. This was the first high-profile major coordinated banning across multiple platforms at the same time and marked a new beginning for censorship. The narrative of YouTube radicalization gained teeth with the release of the infamous Data and Society report, which claimed, quote, content creators in the AIN, Alternate Influence Network, claim to provide an alternate media source for news and political commentary. They function as political influencers who adopt the techniques of brand influencers to build audiences and sell them on far-right ideology. The study claims that reactionaries, meaning in this case anyone opposed to social justice and left-wing politics in general, use an alternate appeal of relatability and accountability to gather followers and influence them in the direction of the far right. This is then blamed on the recommendation system that YouTube uses, in which someone can hop from Joe Rogan to Richard Spencer. These claims were ridiculous back then as they are now, as various other studies even at the time concluded that this radicalization wasn't happening. But this one study was enough to begin a push towards massive changes in the coming months. And next year, more studies and hit pieces would be introduced to achieve the same ends, especially after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting was tied to online hate in late 2018 due to the shooter's postings on Gab.ai. Throughout the year as well, further skirmishes between Antifa and commentator Gavin McInnes' group, the Proud Boys, continued in response to Portland and other cities where Antifa activity was regular. YouTube suspended Gavin and the Proud Boys accounts in response to the New York City arrests and also in advance of the one-year anniversary of Charlottesville. A very notable suspension that wasn't entirely political would be the banning of Mumkey Jones, the dark comedy YouTuber known for parodying Diary of a Wimpy Kid with Elliot Rodger. By the end of 2018, YouTube says in a blog post that they have made more than 30 policy updates to accommodate the wishes of civil rights groups and other advocacy organizations to combat hate speech. Gab.ai, the social media platform mentioned earlier, was also kicked off of its infrastructure at this time. Stripe, PayPal, and their hosting provider, denting the build-your-own-platform argument. Gab would continue to develop, however. After finding, and in some cases creating, their own infrastructure, they would be back online within 7 days. Facebook made major algorithm changes this year, which resulted in catastrophic traffic loss for Breitbart and other right-leaning websites, even Fox News. The news section was also changed behind the scenes to not allow most conservative sources. Reddit, in a blog post right before 2019, revamped its quarantine system in order to not allow revenue to be generated from subreddits and to further isolate communities that were put under that lockdown. This would come in handy next year. 2019 began with YouTube following through on its promise to stop recommending videos that were conspiratorial in nature. In a blog post, YouTube says that they are taking a closer look at how it can reduce the spread of content that comes close to but doesn't quite cross the line of violating its rules. With this, we see the idea of the YouTube caste system being reinforced even more, and more changes were to come when tragedy would strike. In March of 2019, after the terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand left 50 Muslims dead, online radicalization was quickly blamed for the attack. The shooter's manifesto repeated various far-right talking points about immigration and demographic change, and in the self-shot footage of the attack, the shooter said, "Subscribe to PewDiePie," referencing the PewDiePie vs. T-Series feud. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia said in response to the shooting, "The rapid and wide-scale dissemination of this hateful content live-streamed on Facebook, uploaded on YouTube, and amplified on Reddit shows how easily the large platforms can still be misused. It is even clearer that YouTube in particular has yet to grapple with its role in facilitating radicalization and recruitment." Facebook has been used to livestream shootings in the past, but this attack led to the fine-tuning of their AI systems to detect and take down violent acts. Reddit, in response to the attacks, banned the subs "Watch People Die" and "Gore" after the mods defended leaving the shooting footage up. In response to this, the social media website had a renewed mandate to crack down. YouTube introduced new rules in a blog post. Today, we're taking another step in our hate speech policy by specifically prohibiting videos alleging that a group is superior in order to justify discrimination, segregation, or exclusion based on qualities like age, gender, race, caste, religion, sexual orientation, or veteran status. They promptly began removing more identitarian-minded content from the website. Twitter expanded rules to fight against, quote, hateful content to include language that dehumanizes others based on the religion or caste. Twitch.tv, a live streaming service, also began introducing new rules and regulations against hate. A notable casualty of this was Nick Fuentes, who was banned shortly after the Trainwrecks TV debate with Destiny and Hassan Piker. Hassan's advocacy for extremist left-wing ideologies and his future justification of September 11th did not warrant the same punishment as beating Destiny in a debate, I guess. The framing of the Christchurch massacre was the one in which the most censorious activity took place this year. Facebook, in a coordinated effort, told certain media outlets about the upcoming bannings of high-profile right-wingers under an embargo, meaning that media sources couldn't post a story until a specific date and time. Facebook would ban Paul Nehlen, Paul Joseph Watson, and many others within 24 hours for violating rules on hate speech. The company in a statement revealed that they not only took into account the content posted by these accounts on their website, but also their offline activity. Louis Farrakhan was also banned in this wave, prompting attacks on Facebook from the left. This year, President Donald Trump also gave his infamous statement about tech censorship in response to conservative activists warning of his and the GOP's downfall if tech censorship continued, saying that he was monitoring the situation. This comment and possible actions came as discussions over what is known as Section 230 started popping up. Section 230 is a part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, the first major communications overhaul in the country since the Communications Act of 1934 created the FCC. The act was passed to fight access to pornography on the internet, and it established Section 230 in order to separate websites into categories of platform and publisher. The platform label allows a website to be immune from punishment from ISPs or to be held liable for content on the website due to a platform not making editorial decisions, therefore the content is not the responsibility of it. A publisher, however, can be held liable for the content on its website, as it makes editorial decisions and, as the name suggests, publishes on its own the content of its site. The discussion around this rule revolved around the question of whether or not the social media companies were no longer platforms, but should now be considered publishers due to their editorializing behavior. Critics of reforming this say that if Section 230 protections were taken away, that these websites would be hit with an endless onslaught of lawsuits and fines taking them offline, while conservative proponents of 230 reform want to punish the social media companies for partaking in censorship. Worth noting is that Section 230 reform technically has bipartisan support, but for different reasons. Democrats in Congress critique the social media companies, as we have discussed, for reasons opposite of conservatives. They feel that the tech giants are not censoring enough and are allowing acts of violence to be inspired by them. They want 230 reform in order to hold tech companies accountable for allowing too much hate speech. Picking up where we left off with YouTube, there was also an incident where Vox's Carlos Maza attempted to get YouTube to ban Steven Crowder for harassing them, and by harassment he meant he kept making response videos to Vox's content. Maza didn't just attack YouTube, but also attacked the advertisers who appear on Crowder's content and seem to be attempting to trigger another adpocalypse, in order to financially punish those who disagree with his and Vox's political views. Maza argued that YouTube was too scared to enforce their own rules against hateful content, which is what he considered Crowder to be partaking in. Maza, it should be noted, has in the past called explicitly for violence and has not been penalized. This episode ended in Maza being humiliated on the internet and Crowder still gets to be on YouTube. 2019 also saw more claims of algorithmic radicalization, of the publishing of the New York Times story of Caleb Cain, in which a sad, lonely liberal college dropout was radicalized by YouTubers like, let me check my notes here, Stefan Molyneux and Philip DeFranco, into being alt-right, and then after watching, and again let me check here, Destiny debates and ContraPoints became a liberal again. The piece also included the famed historical economist Milton Friedman, and again, Philip DeFranco of all people. Also of hilarious note, he apparently referred to Lawrence Southern as his Fashy Bay. Laughable as the whole story is on its face, it was still influential and solidified without a shadow of a doubt in all the important people's minds, those important people being the tech giants and journalists, that YouTube was a radicalization machine that would need to be reined in, so the activist groups continued their work in influencing writing up new rules for YouTube to enforce. Later in the year, Red Eyes TV would be banned. To push back on some of the claims of radicalization, a study was posted in late 2019 decrying the claims and in fact proving that previous algorithm shifts had completed their intended purposes. Algorithmic extremists examining YouTube's rabbit hole of radicalization explains in the abstract, instead, the algorithm is shown to favor mainstream media and cable news content over independent YouTube channels with slant towards left-leaning or politically neutral channels. Our study thus suggests that YouTube's recommendation algorithm fails to promote inflammatory or radicalized content, as previously claimed by several outlets. In other words, the algorithm was now steered away from small and original content creators and towards mainstream corporatized content. On Reddit in 2019, things escalated in the platform's fight against right-wingers. The Reddit admins placed its recently updated quarantine on the largest right-wing subreddit, The Donald. After years of virtually being unable to reach the front page of their website and its traffic artificially downgraded, they were preparing The Donald for its final year of life. In response to this, the subreddit attempted to create a new forum, thedonald.win, which resulted in many controversies of its own, to say the least. Various left-leaning subreddits were quarantined as well, to be fair, but the only major sub that would go on to be banned was Chapo Trap House. Another issue we haven't discussed is the accusation of a dog whistling type content, which Reddit has a large history of. Special cases are that of /r/friendworld, which was banned this year after gathering a large base. /r/zoomerright and other subreddits tied to the dissident right were banned as well. The prediction given by many conservative commentators who originated online in 2016 was that by either 2020 or sometimes close to that, we would reach a state of total deplatforming and an end to the free and open Wild West internet. Although we aren't quite there yet, 2020 and the beginnings of 21 would see by far in a way, the most aggressive information control and censorship of all the years prior, using all the tools and techniques that have been developed over the past 4 years. Let's start with the coronavirus. When the pandemic began, the social media platforms edited their guidelines in order to stop disinformation about the virus and to enforce the CDC and World Health Organization orthodoxy. YouTube put labels under videos mentioning coronavirus like they did with conspiracy videos and promoted the trusted sources to the top of search results. Twitter put disinformation labels on tweets that were deemed to be misleading. Facebook followed suit as well. These measures under the guise of public health led to the silencing of academics who disagreed with the CDC, nurses who spoke out against lockdowns, and the shutting down of groups who would be organizing anti-lockdown protests, which started kicking off in April. These measures would also come in handy when the tech giants remembered that there was an election coming up this year. In late May, after George Floyd overdosed while being arrested, the new and improved BLM movement came roaring back into the spotlight. With the resurgence of BLM and the widespread support it had among white liberals who ran the social media platforms, they quickly got to work in promoting the movement and suppressing its opponents. Starting with Twitter, in a blog post in early June, they once again expanded its rules against dehumanizing speech, while also excusing the ongoing riots across the country, allowing GoFundMe campaigns to get rioters arrested out on bail to be shared extensively on the platform. The same happened with Facebook and Instagram. Twitter also began putting labels on tweets and stopped interaction with tweets that they said were encouraging violence. This was enforced pretty one-sidedly, however, as calls for dead cops and dead white people in response to Floyd's death were only suppressed if they gathered an egregious amount of likes. Twitter also directly supported organizing bail funds for protesters and the spread of pro-BLM information. The most notable use of this tool was when the President of the United States himself, a little bit over a year after he said he was monitoring the situation, had one of his tweets tagged with the encouraging violence label for suggesting the use of military force against the riots spreading across the country. This marked the first time of the many times the President of the United States himself would be directly censored on Twitter and later the entire visible internet. Twitch.tv also suspended Donald Trump's Twitch page for encouraging violence. On YouTube, earlier in the year before Floyd's death, Nick Fuentes and his channel were terminated, but after Floyd's death, a renewed outcry for censorship was heard. Various channels were banned for hate speech in the early summer, using the rule changes as years prior, such as Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer and his podcast, as well as others. YouTube also put a tab under videos with links to so-called accurate information on George Floyd, and also under content that mentions him or BLM, taking part in the clear preference for one side. On Reddit, over 600 moderators of hundreds of different subreddits sent a letter to Reddit admins demanding an expansion of anti-hate rules. In response, one Reddit board member resigned, with the intent of replacing him with a black board member, and also began a massive expansion of his rules. In a blog post announcing this, they denounced Reddit's pre-2015 history of being a free speech platform and apologized for not doing enough to combat the rise of Hitler. They didn't say that, but they might as well have, with the pathetic self-loathing from this statement. Reddit began the expansion and explicitly supported the organization of bail funds for rioters and the spread of anti-white hate. The new rules even state that hate directed at majority groups perceived to be in positions of power are allowed. Reddit announced that the Donald would finally be put out of its misery and banned, leaving the only major conservative subreddit up, the neoconservative controlled /r/conservative. With Reddit for the past 4 years, we have seen a glimpse into the future of the controlled internet. Despite the accusations of inaction from the delusional default submods, Reddit has been the most aggressive in banning and suppressing of conservative content, and in 2020 reached a possible endgame. Finally, a respectable platform filled only with communists, socialists, leftists, progressives, liberals, rape fantasizers, every pornographic fetish you can think of minus underage, but even that has some workarounds, and acceptable conservatives like Bill Kristol, John McCain, and Nikki Haley. Over the summer, Twitter continued to censor the president as he routinely tweeted law and order, and any action he attempted to announce to quell the rioting, which caused $2 billion in damages, were met with suppression from the company. Instagram, as well as Facebook, also took the habit of directly promoting through its Explore algorithms pro-BLM content and the bail funds, a topic to be discussed another time, however, still important to mention. After the violent summer came to a close, the election season was in full swing, prompting more last-minute rule changes in order to make the correct candidate win. In response to the use of mass mail-in votes and concerns over electronic machines, the tech companies decided to take harder stances on speech relating to election security. Twitter, in a blog post, announced harsh new guidelines. Quote, "People on Twitter, including candidates for office, may not claim an election win before it is authoritatively called. To determine the result of an election in the United States, we require either an announcement from state election officials or a public projection from at least 2 authoritative sources. National news outlets that make independent election calls, tweets which include premature claims will be labeled and direct people to our official U.S. election page. Tweets meant to incite interference with the election process or with the implementation of election results, such as through violent action, will be subject to removal. This covers all congressional races and the presidential election." They also added prompts when attempting to retweet or like tweets that were deemed to be misinformation, with the so-called corrected information from authoritative sources. Twitter also added that content they deemed would intimidate voters or lead to votes not being counted would be banned. This resulted in concerns about mail-in ballots, concerns shared by the Carter-Baker Commission on Election Reform that took place after the 2000 and 2004 elections, were heavily censored and dismissed as misinformation. Most famously, the internet companies censored and removed discussions about the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop and connections to the Chinese business state. They also led to the suppression of President Trump himself after declaring he won the election, after it seemed like he swept the Midwest after Florida was called. Facebook, YouTube, and Reddit introduced identical rules, and subsequent censorship of those topics continued up into Election Day. The social media platforms were also accused of not sharing get-out-to-vote information with Republican-leaning demographics, but these claims were not reinforced with hard data, as there was little time to collect it in the lead-up to the election. All in all, the stage was set for the election and its aftermath. 4 years of cutting the legs off of the vast array of internet influencers that helped Trump get elected, and restricting the flow of information while directly propagandizing users with pro-BLM messages for 6 months straight, set the stage for the election aftermath. Amazingly, with all these structural disadvantages, the election was 50-50, with Republican gains down ballot in all 50 states, but with Trump losing the presidential election. Accusations of voter fraud by Trump resonated with his supporters after the 4-year onslaught of racist Nazi Hitler claims from the media, as well as the censorship that cut down his movement's ability to share information and normalize their ostracization from polite society, went virtually unopposed. The Stop the Steal movement quickly began gaining steam after Joe Biden was declared the winner, and the social media companies got to work. As the recent rule changes about declaring premature victory and misinformation about voting were liberally enforced upon Stop the Steal organizers and on the information they were sharing to support claims of fraud and replacing the claims with authoritative information. President Trump's statements on Twitter were routinely silenced in this few-month period, as were all his supporters who agreed with his claims of a stolen election. The crackdown, however, truly began after the end of Stop the Steal with the Capitol riots. The Capitol riots in January of 2021 that took place after Trump hosted a rally in D.C. to protest the counting of the Electoral College resulted in swift action from the tech giants. Donald Trump, after giving a half-assed statement about the incident, was banned permanently on Twitter, followed by YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and the rest of the visible internet. The alternate accounts he attempted to use, such as his official campaign accounts, were banned as well. A mass banning of accounts who were seen as supporting the riots were banned, and a renewed crackdown on QAnon-affiliated accounts led to the bannings of thousands upon thousands of accounts, seen in the dropping follower count of Republican politicians. The Mercer brothers' own platform Parler was also the platform from Amazon and the Apple and Google stores due to their reluctance to ban QAnon content, and specifically Lynn Wood, the former lawyer who had a mental breakdown and threatened to kill Mike Pence. The alternate streaming platform DLive.tv also began censoring those who were at the Capitol during the incident, and implemented new rules making it so all political content on the website could not be monetized. The bannings included Baked Alaska, Nick Fuentes, and IRL streamer Wooza. The Capitol riots and subsequent ban waves are arguably the climax to the trends that we have seen for years. Inconsistent rule changes, an algorithm shift based on real-life events and the political narrative of the left, resulting in the censorship and suppression of the right wing on the internet. These rule changes and updates have negatively affected everyone on the platforms, as countless careers have been destroyed, and those caught in the crossfire now have to jump through new arbitrary hoops in order to not get banned. Ryan Dawson has been one of the most influential thinkers, and his work has heavily influenced the direction of the right wing in this country, especially during the 2016 election. Even just a few weeks ago, Ryan Dawson's YouTube channel was once again banned and he has launched a new website for his content. But in 2021, the internet has been reworked in order to make sure that he has as little influence as possible. He, among countless others, are victims of this tragedy. It is also worth pointing out that with the vast bannings of accounts on Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of the platforms, it has made future historical research on this time period extremely challenging. If archive.is and the other archive services did not exist, making a video like this would have been near impossible.